Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum. St. Augustine is perhaps the most significant Christian thinker after St. Paul, often pictured by Western painters holding in his hand his heart, blazing with passionate love. He consistently and repeatedly insisted from his earliest writings until close to his death that the essential characteristic of God is love. Yet he also insisted on the doctrines of original sin and everlasting punishment for the damned. How do you reconcile this apparent contradiction? And can it bring us any closer to understanding a God seemingly indifferent to human suffering? Margaret Miles is the emerita professor of historical theology at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where she also served as dean for 6 years. She was the first tenured woman at Harvard University Divinity School, where she taught from 1978 to 1996. The author of more than 25 books, she has studied Augustine for over 50 years. And while deep in her writing her latest and perhaps last book, Beautiful Bodies, she joins me today for a conversation about some of her exciting findings. Margaret, thanks so much for joining me today.
Lovely to be here.
You know, this week is the 30th anniversary of the first Sunday sermon I ever preached. And you were one of the only people.
St. John's?
Yeah, St. John Divine in Bowdoin Street.
Yeah.
And you and St. John the Evangelist, and you and I were there, and Heidi was there. I can't remember who else was there.
Owen.
But Owen was there, exactly.
Yeah.
I remember hearing Owen preach there, one of the most memorable sermons I've ever heard. But it was a snowy day, and it was cold in the church. And that's one of my memories. And the other of my memories is talking with you in the hallways at the seminary, and you saying to me, you know, Malcolm, I don't want you to feel nervous that your teachers are going to be there at the service. And you said, you know, we have concerns and worries, and we want to hear the good news too from you. And it was one of the most important pastoral moments of my life. I'll never forget it. And I'm so grateful to you, especially, like I said, I'm thinking about it so much this week as the 30th anniversary came by. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about St. Augustine's preaching. I mean, I know about the City of God, and I've read his Confessions so many times, so carefully. Yeah. And De Trinitate, I read his thesis on the Trinity. But I don't hear very much about his preaching from scholars.
Yes, you don't. And that's what has been so engaging to me, really, because you see a different Augustine when you listen to his talking intimately, really, with his friends. I mean, 600 people could be there. That's how many the church held in Hippo, where he was the bishop. But his sermons are full of what everyone has considered throwaway lines, like he'll say suddenly in a sermon, but this is the way I see it. And don't let that stop you seeing it your way.
Wow.
Or he'll say, I'm just a person like you, and full of fears and full of anxieties and full of bodily ailments. You know, he'll just connect with the people listening in a way that is very moving, I think, and very human, and should be paid more attention to in terms of at least the old Augustine. Now, the young Augustine, 40-ish, that's pretty young to me anymore.
Yeah, me too.
Who wrote the Confessions, is considered usually the standard, the essential Augustine. However, it still has to be considered that that's an early Augustine. He wrote that book several years after he was ordained a priest, not yet a bishop. He hadn't been with Christianity very long, except he had in a way because his mother was a Christian, but he had to, you know how it is, he had to really avoid his mother because she was about to turn his life into something else according to her values. Anyway, so what he's doing in that, in his Confessions, is he is traveling back in meditation over all the circumstances, choices, conversations of his life, because he is persuaded that that's where you find God's action, interior to the external situations, which are so often so demanding, even blinding, that you pay no attention to what's going on inside those. And in fact, he felt he was being coached all the way.
Yeah. Drawn in
Interior
love.
to his good and bad decisions, he says, in the retractions. It's a very beautiful and puzzling kind of thing. And I have to say, I tried his meditation for over a year. I went back over stuff in my life, and I did discover some things that were life-orienting to me, I will just say. But he changed in midlife his orientation to God's interior action in the particular individual that he was, and changed to a self-identity as part of the body of Christ. A new community, a new orientation where it wasn't all about him. He was not, as one author says, stuck in the self any longer. He was in the body of Christ, and he makes that so evident in all his sermons. He's just like them.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, I mean, I love that, because you can imagine somebody converting to Christianity, and in those first 3 or 4 years having a very valuable perspective on
Absolutely.
things. Because he has a foot in both worlds still.
Yeah.
But you can also imagine that he hasn't really, just in the same way, when I've been surfing for 3 years, when I've been playing basketball for 3 years, when I've been speaking French for 3 years, I just hadn't learned it yet. Mm-hmm. So there is a way in which I'm glad that you offer that perspective, that idea that he might be learning as he goes along. Talk a little bit more about just like, you talk about that meditation method. Maybe you can fill that out a little bit. You mean like the practice that he used to write, to go through his life, to write it out. Is that what you mean in terms of just like the confessions?
Well, the Confessions is a good example of his meditation method, I think, in going back over, from where he was then, going back over those circumstances and finding why it was important, underneath, inside, intus, his Latin word. And he says that frequently. But he was in danger of solipsism at that point, just focusing on the self. And it was his preaching through the Psalms. He preached the Psalms for 20 years. And it's in those Psalms that you can pick out the moments it's laborious to do because there's a lot of words.
Yes.
20 years worth of preaching. Sorry, Malcolm.
No, it's a lot. So that's a whole bookshelf. That's like this much of single-spaced.
But he's working himself into that new perspective on who he is, what his identity is, and it's not himself personally any longer.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful.
Peter Brown's biography of St. Augustine, I just remember reading it. It was one of the favorite books I've read in my whole life. I just enjoyed it so much. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just St. Augustine's context and time. What were some of the cultural, political pressures? What was life like in Augustine's time?
That's a big question.
It is a big question. You can always pass on any question I give you to.
Well, it's an intricate question, really, and needs to be asked and needs to be thought through. In many ways, we have so much information about Augustine, and then we have so little, really, in terms of what he was responding to in terms of his upbringing, which we know tends to stay with us.
Right. Oh, completely.
Yeah. And he was a very public person. Privacy in late antiquity was sort of not a value. He lived with people all the time. He was never alone. He spoke what he was thinking, and they said, "You're full of it, Augustine," you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
he would, sorry, but many of them did say to him that he had gotten the wrong idea, and he went back and thought about it. You know, you don't see all that
Right.
in what he writes, really. You see it now and then. You see an increment of compassion in his preaching, not in his doctrinal treatises so much. And that is what, for the past 2 centuries, Augustine scholars have been fascinated by.
Yeah.
The arguments about predestination and the controversies of Donatism and Pelagianism, the different interpretations of Christianity that people right around him had and argued. And somehow, I just always thought that the history of Christianity should not be taught as it usually is, and probably was by me too. And that is a history of increments of getting closer and closer and closer to the truth. Every council argued about things and chose one way of thinking. And then the next council, the Council of Nicaea was the first one, ecumenical. But every time that there was a council that specified, no, this is what we believe, this is what we have to believe, tons of people fell away and went into orthodoxy, Gnosticism. You know, a number of other churches formed out of the people who had genuinely different experiences of Christian faith. And that should be the history of Christianity, a history of diversity, not a history of shaving off everyone that didn't believe exactly as we do.
Yeah.
You know, that's so sad to me, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought to think, you know, maybe the thing that we most need spiritually is, you know, something that comes from Pelagius. I mean, when you were describing it, I just had this imagination. I could imagine like a decision tree, like, so you know, at this council you can go this way or this way, and this council you go this way or this way. And so you end up with this whole range of possibilities, and we're like studying just this one branch, when there's all these other branches in the whole tree.
Yeah, and we're taught to read those authors thinking that they were heretics. That's Augustine's word for them. They're heretics. But in fact, well, you mentioned Pelagius. There's something to be said for old Pelagius, I think, in that he thought one should try and struggle a bit.
Yeah.
And not be so utterly dependent on God as Augustine insisted. And so I know why Augustine insisted, because he wanted the doctrine of predestination. How does that? How does it affect our lives? Well, Augustine said in one way, not at all. It happened before we were born, before the foundation of the world, and he kept saying, leave it to God. Don't worry about it. You're not going to understand it. And then he brought up another aspect or facet of God, which was God is love. 1 John 4:16, he quoted that all the time. And he developed it all the time, his thinking about that. That is the God we have to do with as living human beings. Yeah. And the rest, leave it to God. Because there's nothing you can do. Nothing. Endless petition, living a good life, nothing you can do. And so it kind of doesn't matter about your life now, and you better get a grip on that with God's love. He had 3 names for God. God is love, as I've said. God is life itself. This is very intriguing to me. He says in Doctrina Christiana 1:8, in case you're taking notes, anyone who thinks of God as anything other than life itself has an absurd notion of God. Now that's pretty powerful. We don't know about our lives. We don't choose what we confront, what helps us and what harms us. we don't. It's just life itself. And then you deal with it by participating, not developing in yourself, participating in the God is love.
Yeah.
And he said God is beauty, too.
Beauty, yeah.
God is love, life, and beauty.
Oh, I love that. I love the idea of God as life. Because...
I do too.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about Marshall Rosenberg in Nonviolent Communications this week, and he does believe there's a kind of life that all people have, and that we all bring, and that is at the service of the people who are around us. I wonder, I think of this thought so many times, because you're reading Augustine in Latin, you're having a different experience than I am in reading my translations.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Latin and just how that changes your experience of St. Augustine. Like, what are some of the differences between the Latin language and our English, and how does that influence your understanding of Augustine?
I can't get too technical with that because many people have better Latin than I do.
Yeah.
All those years I was teaching and being a dean, there was no use for my Latin, so I had to recover it when I retired, and that was a strenuous occupation for a while. I had it while I was writing my dissertation, and then there's a big hiatus. So my Latin is not wonderful. But reading translations and putting them next to Latin, you see how much of the translator gets into that interpretation. And for a time I was, angry is not too strong a word, I guess, about the way that the old Augustine was vilified. His sermons are dated according to things like, well, that argument was loose and sloppy, or the grammar isn't even perfect there. Stuff like that the translators will come right out and say, I documented about 25 in one book of translations of Augustine's sermons. And they skew. It's not just that you're doing a throwaway line, yeah, he's old. It's that they skew the way you read him and the importance of what he's saying. And that all comes in sermons. And that's why I had to read Latin to get past those translations, because I hope there's no translator here, but I have to mention the comment that is attributed to Thomas More, who said translators translate because they want to find something in the text. And if they don't find it, they put it there.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about so what do we have from Augustine? Why do we have so much material from him, and what's missing from it?
I'm not to the point of asking what's missing.
Yeah.
Isidore of Seville in the 6th century says, anybody that tells you they've read all of Augustine, right now they're a liar.
Lying. I love that. That's great.
So I'm not going to tell you that I read all of Augustine because I haven't.
Right, exactly.
No, it's almost infinite.
So is there a story, like a reception history of the material? Like, how was it saved?
First, all his sermons were taken, written down by scribes.
So someone's transcribing.
And we have some of his sermons, like 5 different scribes were taking them, and they're almost identical.
Wow.
They were superb scribes, really. So that's the first interpretation of Augustine that you get. And after that, then we work with the material that the scribes heard, and they may have left things out. Who can write that fast?
Yeah, exactly.
But from then on, it's downhill as soon as you leave the Latin. And the medieval people also interpreted Augustine in the ways that they approved of, and they were all monastics by this time, not priests preaching to people.
Yes.
And so you get a different emphasis on meditation, on celibacy, than Augustine himself even ever had, although he was dedicated to celibacy and thought it was the better way. He never urged it on anyone else, which is sort of praiseworthy, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in the paper you talk about his, gosh, I can't remember the exact phrase, but his sexuality, like his sexual interest, I guess, is one way I would paraphrase you. Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting that when he was writing the Confessions and confessing to his vivid and avid pursuit of sex, he never mentions a beautiful body. He doesn't blame anyone else, and this is quite unique among the church fathers, frankly. He doesn't blame women for seducing him.
Yeah.
He claims it all himself. It's his lust and his problem. But it's a big problem. So he doesn't see, he even intimates as early as Confessions that lust is a visual block. You don't see the beauty of the whole individual. If you're being acquisitive in a sexual way.
Yeah. That's
Isn't
a
that
fascinating observation.
Yeah, and it's not until he gets to talking about, the beautiful bodies of the title, I have to admit, are resurrection bodies, bodies from whom mortality has been, he thinks, overcome.
Yeah.
And all kinds of bodily ills or deformities or anything that troubles us about our bodies now has disappeared. It's kind of a fantastic image. If you try to think about it, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, it does.
It is us, but it's not us.
Right.
Because we don't know bodies that don't age, that don't get sick, that don't die.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's something I've always been interested in your work. I mean, you really are a pioneer. I mean, you are the only one of your kind. You're the first woman to receive tenure at Harvard Divinity School. You received tenure only 3 years after the Episcopal Church even began ordaining women as priests. So I know that has influenced your reading of Augustine. And I can imagine even that comment that you just made, that all of us remember being in conversations with people who are like, this person's not interested in me, they're interested in how I look. And that's the first time I've ever had that conversation. I mean, I was aware of that as a young person, but I never was able to articulate it until you just said that. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how Augustine looked to you as a woman, and then as Augustine looks to you as an older person too, because I think you may have insights that you're bringing from your own life that are helping you to understand his thought in a different way.
well, I think that is an important thing, that you have a different vantage point when you're old, and you have your whole life to look at and work with.
Yeah.
You know? And you don't know who you are entirely until you have that, I think. So in his culture, old age was much more revered, and it was assumed that people knew stuff because they'd lived so long, you know?
Yeah.
In our age, in our time, in our society, it's quite different. And youth is valued, and old age, as the interpreters, as the translators show so blatantly, is thought of as, human life is thought of as you reach a peak and then it's all downhill.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
It is sad.
It's an abuse of life.
It's an abuse of life. And you know what makes it so much worse? I mean, my friend was he was the best, most highly recruited tailback out of California in like a 5-year period. And yeah, I mean, his peak was when he was 20. You know, everything's been downhill.
Sports is, yeah. What sport?
Football.
Oh, I couldn't tell.
He hurt his knee. Yeah, no, he couldn't. No one could. But he hurt his knee when he was 20.
Yeah.
And you're right. But that attitude is just that the most important things of us are things that we're exhausted when we're young people.
I know.
Yeah. Because even when we were talking about me, I mean, for me, 30 years, that's it. I mean, that's my whole adult life. I've known you. But for you, it's just, that's 30 years means something completely different. And our relationship is really different because you see it in a much broader span of time.
Well, I'm grateful for old age, actually.
I feel the same way.
For the same
being
reasons, yeah.
I mean, I don't know how old I am, but being in my 50s,
don't?
that it is so much better than being in your 20s. And
Hang on.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm doing my best.
I'm 86.
Because we're always easy to remember our ages because there's 30 years difference between the two.
Oh, I know, to the month.
To the month, exactly.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that when Heidi and I first arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Heidi was working at the Women's Studies
yes.
in that little White House on
Yes.
Kirkland. But it was a lovely place. And just in our short time there, we met so many prominent women's studies scholars.
Yes.
And so even this last person I interviewed on the forum was Patricia Williams, who we met when we were in our early 20s, and who's just was a lovely person. But I wonder if you can talk about some of the people that you met as kind of your fellow pioneers in studying women's issues and women's history.
Well, there was a program at the Harvard Divinity School, Women's Studies in Religion,
Yes.
which was very carefully fought over. And out of that developed a doctoral program, religion, gender, and culture.
Right? Religion, gender, and culture, yeah.
Yes, right. And there were 6 women scholars brought into the school for a 1-year appointment. And that's where I met the women that are doing the deep work on women's studies, Rosemary Ruther.
Oh, yes.
Then we hired Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza.
Right.
And, there were just many that came not only from Christianity, but from world religions that had their different analysis of how sexism worked within their religion.
Yeah.
Not just their culture, although that was a big piece of it, of course. So that was very educating to me, because when I came there, I knew nothing about it. I had my doctorate here, and none of my advisors at all were informed or pushed me to be informed about gender studies. They didn't consider it a field, in short. And that's how I was hired at Harvard, because the women, the doctoral students there knew some doctoral students here. And when I was being interviewed, they asked the women here about my program and the woman who they mainly spoke with, Mary Hunt.
Oh, how funny.
Yes. I don't know to this day what she told them, and whether I was hired because I knew nothing about it, or whether I was hired because she said, well, she's a fast learner.
I wonder if you can tell us what those faculty meetings must have been like, to be the only woman in this environment. I mean, what did that feel like, and what do you remember about those days?
Oh, I have a lot of salacious stories about that, but inappropriate here. Actually, Diana Eck was
yes, right.
was placed
Gosh, she's
on
a wonderful
the
person.
Yes, she is.
Gosh, I loved her.
Yeah, and very kind to me. Being the only woman, she was aware of that, and would stop after a meeting and ask me how I was doing, and I appreciated that so much. Yeah. Because it was lonely and cold, literally cold. I didn't have a piece of wool clothing when I went east.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and Constance Buchanan, too, is the other person who I remember. Right. That just like people who I admired so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing, amazing scene for sure.
But
speaking about the cold, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just I have no idea if this is the case, or if, scholarship at that level is so international, it doesn't matter where you are. But the Northern California scene, how does that differ from the Northeast in terms of just like the world of scholarship and the world of study? Maybe not at all, but I think about that sometimes.
It's much more rigorous.
Yeah.
Well, every place isn't Harvard, and Harvard is known for being rigorous. So.
Yeah. Well, I also just think, Gordon Kaufman and Richard Niebuhr were going down to New Haven, meeting with scholars there, theologians there who were, from New York City and Pennsylvania. So there was a way in which there was just a greater concentration of, of very, very advanced scholars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I say something about the topic of
Yes.
What I have been expected to talk about is how Augustine could love the God in whom he believed.
Yeah.
And it's something that troubled me for the whole 50 years that I studied Augustine. How could he say God is love and yet insist upon, in doctrinal treatises, insist upon a God who condemns most of the human beings to damnation, to a vivid hell that he describes in City of God. It's so painful, I can't read it. But he insists on that. Why? What is it to him that's so important? Because he's all about living now, in participating in the body of Christ, in God's love. How can he be there in both places?
Yeah.
Well, I figured it out for myself. It may not work for everybody, but he is on about, throughout his life, there are two things he's on about that you don't hear much in studies about him, and one is feeling. He thought that feeling was an absolutely fundamental part of thinking, that it enters your thinking, and scholars now, neurologists now are saying this, that there is an there is a stage in your thinking where there has to be feeling. It can be illustrated by Augustine's Confessions even. He'll say, before his famous conversion experience, which was only one of his conversion experience, I think, it was his conversion to celibacy. Yeah. But he had many other, momentary insights or lasting insights.
Take and read, or take, right? The children playing outside his...
Yeah. It's a very emotional experience. It's not about convincing his head.
So describe it to everybody, just because I'm not as good at describing it. But so Augustine is sitting in a room and overhearing children playing outside.
No, he's outside.
He's outside, yeah.
He's in a garden, yes, and he's so disturbed. He's at a crucial point of deciding whether he has to think that he has to be celibate because St. Paul said it was the better way.
Yeah.
So he cannot imagine a consensus between being a sexual person and being in God's service. Those are two separate things and he keeps them quite separate. Yeah. So it's a crucial, horrible thing. He says at one point, he doesn't know himself without being a sexual being.
Yeah. Right, because he can't even imagine what that would be like.
No, he can't.
Yeah.
And so these are terribly conflicting urges and attractions. And so he's flailing about in this garden, crying copiously. Men cried in those days. It was not a sign of weakness, but I've done a lot of work on that, a measure of strong feeling. And I think that's still a loss in our society.
Yeah, I do too.
Anyway.
So he hears the children playing, and that's
he
enough
hears a voice saying, "Carpe."
I can't remember.
I forget what it is in Latin. Anyway, take and read. So he goes and picks up the Bible, and it says, "Not in drunkenness," and it's a verse from Paul.
Yeah.
And not in drunkenness and wickedness.
Licentiousness and wickedness, yeah.
All that.
Yeah.
But, put your faith in Jesus. And that that does it for him. He gets the feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's all about that feeling.
Right.
And that's what he's preaching for, too. He wants people to have that feeling of belief. Belief is not something you assent to intellectually.
Right.
It's a whole orientation of life. And it depends on you getting the feeling of it,
Right.
which is basically love. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because
It's so
as you
rich.
speak, I think about Dick Niebuhr's book, Experiential Religion, that how important that, and I think of Gordon Kaufman's In Face of Mystery as being kind of like in the head, totally in the head. The two of them were so different.
Yeah, they are.
But I think so much of it, in the last 30 years, that we've just realized there's no such thing as being in the head. I mean, that we are integrated beings, that our emotional life is part of that. And so even the emotion that like drives us to learn more, that sense of curiosity, that sense of desire to like be made more complete by what it is that we're learning, it's just all those things are connected. And you're right, I feel that so strongly when I read Augustine, of somebody who understood the emotional life and the value and the importance of it, and didn't have this idea that there's reason versus emotional, that the two are somehow separate.
That's from Descartes.
It is, isn't it?
We don't get it before Descartes.
Yeah.
We can find a distinction in earlier authors, but not a separation.
Yeah.
It's either feeling or thinking. And in our time, I think we have thought that feeling actually interferes with good thinking.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
It just gets unacknowledged. And then it operates on its own.
Yes, it's kind of sublimated almost.
Never
Yeah,
recognized
no one ever
or
addresses
examined.
it. Exactly. I think of just the writing that you've done in the last 15 years. By the way, The Fundamentalist Daughter, that's one of my favorite books of all time.
Oh, really?
I love it so much. And you look at it, it's just like been gone through like a million times. People at Grace Cathedral have heard zillions of different things from it. But you changed a little bit in the way that you approach your project as a writer. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about just kind of your rationale in doing that, how you began to write in kind of more personal, more autobiographically.
Yeah, that's very tricky because you don't want to focus people's attention on yourself, but you want to make that human contact.
Exactly. On the one hand, it's like Ralph Waldo Emerson talking about the preacher. The preacher said nothing that was related to human life at all. The snowstorm outside was vivid, but the preacher was nothing. And so you're right. I think part of what makes your writing compelling is that that gives it life. It gives us a connection. You can tell us Augustine's theory about redemption, but it's so much more helpful to hear about it through the lens of your experience of your own life.
Well, I haven't quite gotten to how Augustine could believe.
Yeah, exactly. So
God.
right back to that.
And I'll just be quick about that because it can be very complicated, but I have to make it not complicated in that I looked at how do his values work and how do they play out in this conglomeration of feeling and thought that is so noted of him. And, in popular religious journalism, I think he's a bad guy now because...
I agree.
And I'm saying, wait, we're losing something here that would help us in not understanding how this works. Well, he was about feeling, as I mentioned, and he was also, and very pointedly, about respect for a God we can never understand. Never. Don't even try, he said. Leave it to God. It's just a concept that our little minds cannot handle, he thought, and look at life. Do you have a rationale for life itself?
Yeah.
No, I don't think any of us do. Anyway, so how he could believe in that God is to leave him aside and say, the God we can participate in is love itself. Is love. So let's get after it, Yeah,
that's like the God that we know versus
Yes.
the God that's impossible to understand.
Right. And that we cannot affect in any way. by
Right.
our actions, by our pleading, nothing.
Yeah, right, because if it's God's going to do it the right way, and we're not going to make any contribution into God's understanding of what the right way to do it
No.
is.
We're going to tell the master of the universe what we
Yeah,
need?
right, completely.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I think that's a natural conclusion from human life. And part of it has to do with humility, which you talked a little bit about.
Humility, too.
And maybe you could
yes.
describe why humility was such an important value for Augustine.
Well, he loved to learn, and this is what I love about him too, that you can watch him because he was so prolific in his writings. He was so generous. You can watch him learning. And he thought of humility as essential for learning. If you think you already know, you're not going to learn.
Yeah.
You're not going to be open to seeing what's before your eyes even. Excuse me.
Yeah, you're right. Humility is like the prerequisite for learning.
And he thought of learning as being, what he said, fully alive. If you're not learning, you're not fully alive.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love that. I do love too, just they're like almost existential truths or truths about meaning. And this is back to like what older people know. Which is only possible it's only possible to have those insights after having been through a certain number of seasons of life.
Yeah, and he so often claims that that what he learns or what he knows is partly a product of his experience. He says, I learned this by my own experience.
Yeah.
That's inviting you to look at him as someone who is speaking with a very strong perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
Not absolutely, but from his life, from what he has learned,
Right.
from being fully alive.
You know, in so many ways, I mean, you know, he was a teacher too, like you are. I mean, he was both of you were. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like, you know, what he learned as a teacher. Like, how did that affect his kind of his pastoral ministry, being a teacher before his conversion? Well,
you'll recall that the young Augustine was a professor of rhetoric.
I know, I was going to say that. I love rhetoric as a field of study, and that's
and at
exactly
first,
right.
in the Confessions, he is totally down on it. He is saying,
Yes.
I was a professor of lies. I taught people how to cheat
Yeah.
one another with their
Right.
with
How to
their
win their
fancy
legal
language.
cases, exactly. How to distract everybody. And
He comes back in Book 4 on Christian Doctrine, appreciating rhetoric and saying, yeah, we shouldn't just leave it to the people that know how to deceive.
Right.
Why can't we be better at it in our preaching
Yeah.
and in our thinking, you know, and in our conduct with one another? Why can't we use what rhetoric has learned? And there are all these things that you can document out of his writing that he learned in rhetoric. Meditation is one thing. He always had a program with steps. That's straight out of rhetoric.
Yeah, yeah.
And so fascinating to see how by the time he was old, he pulled it all in. It was all belonging to him now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's
At
beautiful.
UC Berkeley, I studied rhetoric, and I only needed one class in order to get to major in the program. But I already had another major, and the one class I needed to take, it was basically what you would do is you would read poetry in public. Like so it was like learning how to read things that are printed on the page. I thought, oh, how's that going to help me in the future? Which is basically the only thing that I do is like read things on the page. But yeah, I wonder if some you know, when you look back at all the seminars you taught in Augustine, like what was some of the things the misconceptions that your students had coming into St. Augustine? Like what were kind of their presuppositions about Augustine as they first began to study with you?
Well, first of all, that the Confessions is the essential Augustine.
Yeah.
And it is at one time in his life, but this is a richer person than stopping at one time in his life.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. One of the traditions we have at the cathedral is we take questions, and Rebecca Nessel is picking up some of those questions. You know, I think so much about about the kind of the relation between St. Augustine and the Roman Empire. I mean, one of the things I remember from the class is just, how much things were beginning to unravel at the end of Augustine's life. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, just like the social circumstances and the chaos.
Oh, yeah. Well, he died 3 months into a 14-month siege by they called them the barbarians. The word itself only means non-Greek speakers.
Yeah.
But people from the north who were not a part of the Roman Empire, and his town, the town he lived and worked in, he saw his whole life work ruined, basically. The cathedral disappeared, leveled to the ground, the town was burnt, everybody left.
Yeah.
But his friend, Posidius, who lived with him for many years, actually was a good librarian. He noted all of Augustine's works. What a wonderful gift. We wouldn't have all that beauty if he hadn't done that. And they were saved because the so-called barbarians were Arian Christians. But this is not the reason that they didn't destroy his library, I think, because they did execute 2 Catholic bishops in other towns. Their being fellow religionists was not
enough.
No. So, but we do have those works due to his friend just stepping in and saving them.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus talks about the law having this life. And it's interesting that some written things have survived so much longer than things that seem so much more substantial. So one of the questions is this. Oh gosh, I brought glasses so that I can read the questions better. Okay, I'm almost 73 and increasingly think about Christianity from the perspective of my 2 sons. I'm not objective, but I see them as loving, intelligent, well-educated, well-intentioned. What might Augustine say to them? I would share your opening comment, and God is love, life, and beauty, but what else? For my sons who are both non-believers and who are leaning toward anti-religion? That's a great question.
And there's no direct answer.
Yeah.
Because there's no absolute way to influence someone else in something so close to the bone as religion. I think, I trust in my own case with my children, I trust my example, that I have always been passionate about it. And secondly, life. I think I've been known to say that religion should not be preached to young people because they don't know enough about life yet to see how it works, to see it in the flesh, as it were, rather than as ideas. And that's what has to be trusted, I think. I can't find a better way for myself, my children.
Ellen Clark King, our former vice dean, what she would say is, someone would come to her and say, the church is dying. Look at all the old people who are in church every week. And she said, that's the way it always was. So I sometimes think of that. And you're right. I mean, especially nowadays where younger people there's so many work demands on them. I mean, they're just because of the cell phones and the computers. I mean, they can be doing emails at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night that are related to their work. It's almost like, we've all been colonized by our jobs. And it's hard to find time and space in life to have the kind of reflection that we're talking about, which is essential for recognizing the need for cultivating a relationship with God.
Yeah,
the other
system
thing
of values too is very woven into that, I think.
The other thing too is I remember talking to the Abuna, the Pope of the Ethiopians, who lived in the United States in Los Angeles for many years before becoming, there are young people like 20-year-olds walking up to churches and kissing their churches. Like the devotion and love they feel for the faith is just extraordinary. And so we said that. We said, well, what is that? And he talked about the AIDS crisis, that people who are coming face to face with death have a different orientation to questions of faith than people who may still think they're going to live forever.
Yes, but we don't want an epidemic like that to make us
exactly.
appreciate religion.
And the other thing he said too is just that there are a lot of like distractions in Western culture, like video games is something he talked about.
Oh, just the busyness.
The busyness.
The busyness.
Yeah.
We don't sit and think.
Yeah.
We turn on the TV right away or something.
Right, put on the podcast. Okay, so here is the next question. Could you provide some biographical information about St. Augustine's parents and how his parents impacted his theology? That's the first question. And the second one is, can you offer any information about St. Augustine's views on same-sex relations, unions, marriage? What a great question.
The first question...
His biographical information about Monica, and what was his father's name? I can't even remember. We have a picture of Monica, a stained glass window of
Yes,
Monica.
I know.
So Augustine's parents.
His father was a late convert. He was still a catechumen when Augustine was at home. His mother was a passionate Christian and moved on it with Augustine too rapidly or too forcefully. He was always avoiding her, and eventually he says, she was the voice of God to me, but not at the time.
Yeah, that's funny. That's a good point. I mean, I don't even know what conclusion to draw. She pushed religion, and it may have made him recoil at first, but it certainly had a lasting effect on all of us.
Certainly did. And the
second question, can you offer any information about St. Augustine's views on same-sex relationships, unions, marriage? So same-sex relationships.
I wrote an article about it.
Well, thank goodness we had the perfect person.
Yes, but what I concluded was we don't know his own practices.
Yeah.
There have been all sorts of speculation. He does say in Confessions 3:1 that no friendship was free of his lust. And he never called a woman a friend. Never. Yeah. So... make what you will of it.
Right.
But he loved his friends. He very...
that's one of the things I most took away from Confessions is his deep love of his friends. And when, his friend lost his life, I mean, it was absolutely like a horrible trauma for him.
So you can stack up all that and draw our conclusions, though, from our society.
Yeah, that's right.
And we don't even know how to put the Latin back in his society. Right. We don't know how to do that, really.
Yeah.
What did that word mean in his context, not in ours? We're too eager to put our take on everything and say, oh, clearly that's, that.
Well, one of my favorite things that you wrote in this, which I want to use someday, is you talk about credo, belief. That 3 generations ago, when someone says, I believe...
It meant something.
It meant something.
Yeah, I think the word has been degraded in our culture, belief. We want to say, if we're sure of something, we want to say, I know. And okay, that's subjective knowledge, but it doesn't meet the criterion that is public in our culture, which is the scientific... the hypothesis, the testing. Yeah. You can't do that with the resurrection or something.
Right. Or even just like my wife. I believe, I love her. I'm faithful to her, etc. But it's everything having to do with human relationships is going to have that subjective element.
Yes, absolutely. And
but I love the way that you point out that, and now it's just like, oh, I believe.
It's it's a hesitation.
Yeah.
It means you're not sure.
It means you're not sure.
But it used to mean that I have accepted this as the story of my life, as it is the story of the whole body of Christ, in this case. And I'm figuring out my values in accordance with it.
Yeah.
I'm living in accordance with it. It says something. It doesn't just say, well, I believe the gloves are in the next aisle.
Right, completely. Yeah, no, exactly. But I mean, that's a change in our language in our lifetime. Just imagine what Augustine's Latin was like. Okay, what books on the increments of Christian truth could you recommend that address the failure of contemporary society relating to government and social media and 24/7 news outlets?
I think that's a question for you, Malcolm.
I know I'm going to have to work on it. I'm going to have to work on it for sure.
I don't read contemporary theology.
Yeah, well, one of my questions I had that we just don't have time for is just, I mean, you were married to a theologian, and I just wondered how that changed your perspective on things. But I also have about 50 questions for you that are not.
We disagreed a lot.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Because I have the whole historical approach.
Yeah.
And he had the more intellectual approach.
Yeah.
But it was fun to disagree.
Yeah, and I mean, I love his practical, like his theological questions book. I use that all the time.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, he was very good at boiling. Owen Thomas was a systematic theologian at Episcopal Divinity School and was Margaret's husband, and he died 7 years ago. 7.5 years ago.
2015.
Yeah, 7.5 years ago. But a dear man, my surfing friend. We would go surfing together, the two of us. But I do think of him a lot. Even as you were coming today, I was to wish the two of you could be here together.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's absolutely impossible to believe, but our time is up. I'm preaching and celebrating at the service upstairs, and they're going to be nervous if I don't get up there soon.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you can, as we're wrapping things up, tell us what signs of hope you see as you look around the landscape these days. What signs of hope are you experiencing in just our culture and our society?
Well, I see inroads being made against racism, sexism, that are major in our society.
Yeah.
I mean, you may not, if you watch the news, you may not think so. In fact, this last week had a horrible event.
Oh, yes, that's right.
But
Tyree Nichols' funeral. Yeah.
yes, but now we're seeing those things. Before we had little phones that could record those public those incidents that happen in public.
Yeah.
We were helpless.
Yeah.
But now I think there is a surge of outrage that is going to change things. I think in a few years, I won't be here, but I think what people will see is just be appalled that those things were going on in a culture that claims to be about freedom and equality of persons.
Yeah.
We have terrible, terrible problems. And I'm eager more to talk about what I'm pessimistic about, I'm afraid. So I'm struggling here to find things to hope about. But I do think that there is a level of outrage that can be worked with to change things in some fundamental, not easy and quick way, but long-lasting.
You know, and so much of your work has been that for me. I mean, sometimes you describe things that happened to you as a young woman, as a young scholar. It just makes my hair curl. I mean, it's I mean, people saying
Mine
things.
too.
Yes, I mean, such an upsetting situation to find yourself in,
Yeah.
and you handle it with such grace, and you helped pave the way for women who come behind you and come after you, and all people of goodwill who care about human dignity for every person. It's just been such a central part of your mission as a teacher and as a scholar and as a writer, and I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you could be here today, too.
Me too.
Yeah, what a gift.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know, I'm just going to have to come to your house and ask you the next 40 questions.
Okay. Good.
I will. I'm on my way. You better watch out. Better get the teapot heated up. Well, actually,
I will.
So we have some other announcements. Please keep an eye out for Margaret's book, scheduled to be published in 2024. Next Sunday, please join in an important discussion with Chinatown activist Reverend Norman Fong, City Attorney David Hsu, and Carl Takai of the Asian Law Caucus on the racism and violence against the Asian American community. This conversation is moderated by the Congregation Council member Lisa Wong and will be in the chapter room at 1 p.m. You're very welcome to join us at the 11 o'clock Choral Eucharist upstairs in the cathedral. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give online at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. 76278. Again, thank you so much, Margaret, for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure.